Hello, everyone. We'll get started in just a moment, waiting for everyone to join in. Okay, so hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this wonderful Tuesday morning. Today, Charlie Chung, NovoEd Solutions Architect and Director of Business Development, will be speaking on how to blend learning programs. You can type in your questions into the chat box at any time during the webinar. And don't worry, if you miss something, we will send you a recording of this webinar along with the slides. With that, I'll hand you over to Charlie.
All right. Thank you, Shivani. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the webinar. Let's go ahead and get started. If people join us as we're starting, they can catch up and follow along. The agenda, what we plan to cover today. Do a quick introduction. I want to talk about the blending boom. So there is an increase in blended learning. The concept has been around a long time, but it's only recently that the technologies have caught up and really allowed this to prosper. We're seeing it across a number of organizations. And I'll explain a little bit my perspective on why I think that boom is taking place, why blended can be such a great solution for some of the challenges that we face today. I want to describe and maybe propose a new approach to thinking about blending and how to blend. It will be more or less sort of a challenge to you, I think, in trying to think about things in a different way. I'll talk about some of the challenges in implementing blending and propose a simple 4-step blending blueprint that you can use and follow to help guide your planning activities as you think about creating a blended program. I do want to summarize this at the end for you because I do have a lot of material I'm going to throw out there. So I will make sure to synthesize this at the end and try to tie it up in a bow for you so that it's less confusing and you don't have to rely as much on your own notes. A little bit about me. I've been at NovoEd for about 3 years now, and I've had the privilege actually to work with a number of organizations, a lot of large companies, a lot of universities, nonprofit organizations, training firms, all of whom are sort of riding this new digital online wave. And had the opportunities to talk with them about what they're trying to do, how they're trying to bring things more online. Blended has come up in a number of different areas. And I'm really just happy to be able to share the best practices and things that I've heard and offer that to you as ideas as you continue along your journey. Regarding NovoEd, for those of you who don't know, it's a software platform that started out at Stanford by an engineering instructor and his PhD student, really designed from the ground up to incorporate social learning in a native way. And we find that type of social learning can be a strong way to garner interest, to make the learning stick, to drive engagement, and so forth. So we are used a fair amount among different types of organizations for online and blended programs. I'm going to highlight 3 specific blended programs that are on the NovoEd platform as some of our examples and case studies today. All right, first let's get a little bit of definition out of the way. So blended learning can have different meanings. As I mentioned, the concept has been around for some time. Excuse me as I get my screen control here. But for our purposes, let's take on this definition. So some sort of training program that combines in-person training with some element of online learning. That online learning could be self-paced, They might be virtual in terms of a webinar or online classroom like we have here, but some sort of combination between the two is really one of the most common definitions of blended learning. Let me preview what the information that I'm going to present to you here that I'm going to offer. We have a lot of different concepts. So, I know this is a live webinar, so you don't have the opportunity to fast forward through this and go at extra speed. So I'm actually going to talk probably 20% faster than I normally do, simply because we have a ton of content. And if you stay with me throughout this webinar and you give me your undivided attention and focus, here are the things that you're going to get by the end of it. We're going to cover 3 drivers of just, 3 major trends in learning in general and the advantages that lead to blended learning being on the rise. We're going to talk about challenges with blended learning, how to address those challenges, a new paradigm shift that I'm going to describe in terms of how to think about blended learning, which directly leads to 2 key questions to determine how much of your learning to blend. I will cover a 4-step blending blueprint, which is an approach to planning your blended learning programs. And along the way, we're going to cover 3 gems of learning face-to-face and talk about what those are. And we'll cover 3 case studies as we move along. All right, I hope that sounds good to everyone. And as Shivani mentioned, please enter any questions you may have in the chat. Otherwise, let's proceed. The blending boom. So there's 3 trends I want to describe sort of generally. Pretty well accepted. Number 1, the need to learn is greater than ever. You look at the explosion of information. We had Moore's law operating with the increase in hardware capacity, and now we're entering a phase where information is increasing at a similar or even greater clip. We see companies getting disrupted all the time. Just recently in the news, for example, GE was kicked out of the Dow Jones Industrial Average. It's shedding some of its long-time businesses. It's really refocusing a lot around digital and its remaining businesses. Amazon bought Whole Foods. Media companies are buying each other up because they're worried about competing with Netflix and the studio capability that Netflix is building. So there's just an incredible amount of turbulence with respect to all the change that there's happening. And there's definitely a sense that this change is increasing. What does that mean? That means that, at least from a learner perspective, there's a greater need to learn things today, continually. It's not sufficient to learn just in school and then more or less stop after that. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics in the U.S., I think the average job tenure has declined from something like 7 years down to 4 years on average for each job, something like that. And I think the trend is accelerating. Trend number 2, there's increased focus on applying learning. You're hearing this now a lot. And I think this is partially due to just our increased knowledge of social science. As a field, social science has really only boomed after World War II. And has recently, in the past decade or 2, come into the mainstream. We have Daniel Kahneman, the founder of behavioral economics. He was a psychologist that won the Nobel Prize in economics back in 2002, the first psychologist to do so, starting a whole new field. Now we have a plethora of information about how humans work and how you can change behaviors. We know a whole lot more about these different categories here, about motivation. We know more about intrinsic motivation, how that ties to self-identity, how it's affected by how people frame things, social motivations, gamification. We know that's a hot trend that people are thinking about. We know that in teaching concepts, it's important to chunk information, to sequence them appropriately. That has led to a lot of innovations such as micro-learning, reinforcement learning, deliberate practice and rehearsal, those sorts of things. And we also know a lot more about behavioral change and habit formation. There's work out there about triggers and rewards and loops and things of that nature. And I think because of this awareness, people just recognize that now we can do more than just teach concepts. We can actually drive more behavioral changes when we are talking about learning and training. Trend number 3, the growth of online learning, something I referred to. Here's some data that shows an estimate of how much learning in the corporate world has moved online. So the green bars represent online, the blue bars represent offline or in person, and you see that it's been, first of all, growing since a long time and continuing to grow. The other thing that you'll notice is that the darker blue, for example, are those offline training programs that tend to be higher level skills, things like leadership and communication and so forth. And you can see that those are the least likely to move online. Now, I believe this data are going to change. I think if you look at 2017, 18, 19, 2020, you'll see that even the dark blue line will start to shift and become dark green. We're starting to see that today, and I think that's a trend that will be continuing. So we've got these 3 trends, learning needs that are accelerating, an emphasis on application, and the growth of online learning. Just 3 big trends. And blended learning actually takes advantage of these or supports these trends quite well. Blended learning offers flexibility. It offers authentic contexts for application, and it offers multiple modes. So let me just briefly cover those quickly. In today's day and age, flexibility for learners and in our sort of fragmented days and our fragmented lifestyles, flexibility often makes a difference between being able to do something and not being able to do something. It's not a matter of just convenience. It's really a matter of fitting something in that otherwise wouldn't be possible. So flexibility often now equals feasibility. What about authentic context? So, juxtapose this to a classroom training experience that's an hour, a day, a week. When you can blend into an authentic context, blending online often means that you can stretch this learning out over time. You're not having people necessarily sit for 8 hours in front of a computer. That's not what's meant by online. It's usually chunked out and sequenced and spaced over time. So there's some advantages to learning that over time in terms of retention and micro-learning, et cetera. It allows for practice in real environments. You can have the online exercises, refer people and have them try things out in the real world. If you're teaching listening skills, for example, you might say, try this technique in your next conversation, and then report back after that how things went. So that's an area in which people are actually trying things out in their real organizational contexts and not just in the classroom setting. It's really good for reflection and feedback since you've got time in order to do that. And then it also can play a reinforcement role as well. We know there's the forgetting curve and things of this nature. There's practice and reinforcement that you can have when you stretch this learning out over time in a blended way. And then the third was the multiple modes of learning. Here's a quote, information is encoded and remembered better when it's delivered in multiple modes, sensory modalities, or media. And we know that if you can leverage the benefits of each of the different modalities, say you've got an online discussion forum, say you've got an in-person Socratic Q&A session, if you use the modes for what they're best at, you actually have the opportunity of improving the learning beyond what could be done in a single mode. All right, so that is sort of the summary of the blending boom. That's why we're seeing blending becoming much more popular, I believe, is because it does address those big trends. Now I want to talk about a new approach to blending, and let me describe the old first. It used to be that people would ask the question, how much of our training can we push online? This would usually end up, the answers would usually end up being things like, well, we can put some of the content online, we can put some of the references or resources, maybe some pre-work before they come into the in-person session. If people were a little bit more systematic about it, they might lay out Bloom's taxonomy and point to the lower levels of Bloom's and say, these are the types of things that are best to do online. The rest of it is higher order stuff. That's the stuff that should be done in person. Now, nothing wrong per se with that approach. I think it's a fairly conservative approach, but because of the changes in learning technologies that are out there, because of the changes in user behaviors around technologies, I think we can, let me ask a provocative new question, and that is, let's assume that everything should be online. Now, in that context, what absolutely has to be done in person? So we're really turning this on its head. Instead of saying, what can we push off to be online? Let's assume everything can be done online and figure out, okay, if that's not exactly true yet, then what absolutely has to be done in person? Let's design those things to be done in person because they are the least convenient, the least flexible things, and put the rest online. So really just taking a new angle on this. Now, having said that, how do we determine what absolutely has to be done in person? Of course, it depends. Here's some ideas on this. There are three sort of gems that I would say, at least in my reflections on this, that are really crucial and often are done in person. They don't have to be done in person. You can do some of these things online in other forums, but when you ask people what was the most richest experience they've had in face-to-face training, it's usually along these lines. First, the importance of relationships. So having that context of learning with someone, having that shared experience, often creates bonds that are quite important. So that's a clear one. Next is facilitation by experts. A lot of online learning is kind of solo activity. You're not necessarily getting much expert feedback. So, this sense of getting, input from an expert and guiding you and nudging you in the right direction, this is an important thing that often happens face-to-face. Third is peer learning. One of the things when you look at art schools and you look at master classes for music or art or painting, something like that, it's often a teacher and a student one-on-one, but with the rest of the class observing. And so what's going on there is that the rest of the class is benefiting from seeing the feedback on one individual. And it's sort of a way to see variations on how you might approach things, different perspectives that you might not have thought about, but you're being exposed to that, as well as to the corrective or expert guidance in that context. That's often missing in an online setting. And when you have a classroom, say, or a room with people in it and a facilitator, this is often an important dynamic that's happening. These are the three gems. By the way, just as a extra little bonus here, for those of you who are interested, if you can count, if you can keep track of the number of gems that appear in this presentation, at the very end, if you just put your count of that number in the chat, if you get the right answer, I'll send you a special prize. So just try to add a little gamified fun to this webinar. And don't worry, there's no tricks about where the gems are hidden. They're all in there at appropriate places. So these are the three gems. And these gems are even more important for higher level skill topics. So things like leadership development, innovation, design thinking, etc. Now, why is that? Here's four possible reasons that I've outlined here on the right. These topics, there aren't right answers per se, or there aren't textbook answers. There's nuance. It involves judgment. It's not about learning facts. Oftentimes it's very dependent upon the context and dependent upon experience. So because of this, it does benefit these topics benefit a great deal from working with an expert. It does benefit from tackling it and trying to apply it in one's own context, in observing how others are tackling that issue, in giving feedback to others, and sort of that peer learning. So these higher level topics tend to be more studded with gems, if you will, than some of the more content-focused topics. All right. So how do we go about determining how much we blend, given that new sort of provocative paradigm I presented? Remember, that paradigm is, let's assume we should start at the baseline with everything being online. What do we have to bring in person? So we could ask these two questions. Number one, how important are the three gems that we described? How important are they in your learning objectives in the program that you're developing? Number two, what tech can you reasonably bring to bear to meet those objectives? Remember, those gems are gems of face-to-face. You can achieve a lot of those online, depending on the context. So the question you want to ask is, how can technology meet those gems in your particular context? As if you analyze the two things, as a result, you'll have a gap potentially, and that gap represents the things that you want to accomplish in your in-person component of your blending program. Everything else you can think about initially as being in the online component. All right. Just to summarize a little bit of where we are, I'm sort of recommending a new mindset here with this paradigm. And if we look at sort of old and new mindset, here's a way to contrast these. So why blend? Actually, I'm going to switch these. That was my mistake. It's old on the left, new on the right. If we look at this, the question of why blend, in the old answer was, we're going to blend to save money. But the new answer is, we're going to blend in order to stretch learning over time. What programs should we focus on blending? The old answer is, well, any training that needs to be scaled so that we can make it logistically feasible. Sure, that's important, but the new answer is, well, any training that we really need to make sure that is applied within our organization, because we know that blending can do that well. Which parts of the training program are moving online? The old answer is content. Let's put the pre-work out there. Let's put resources out there. In the new world, the answer is application. Let's have people do exercises and things online, but in a way where they incorporate their actual working environment. So this is sort of a summary of that. I do want to cover the first of our third case studies now before moving on to the next section. This case study is around a training firm called the Presentation Company. You can see their website if you're interested on the lower right, presentation-company.com. They're very focused on helping people create stories in their presentations. They have a few different training topics. There's story strategy, storytelling. There's data strategy, how do you tell stories with data? And there's slide design, how do you create great visual design? So this company, Presentation Company, does great training events across lots of organizations. And one of their programs is on story strategy that they're redesigning to be blended. So before I show you what that looks like, I'm going to show just a diagram of conceptually what you're going to see. Initially, what the Presentation Company had in their program was a one-day in-person training. So you can see there in the classroom, there's a lot of clock time, 8 hours of clock time. And they would say, you know, after this training, we're available for questions. Feel free to reach back out to us. Can you guess how many people reach back out? Not a lot, right? People get busy. They love the program, of course, but it's hard to maintain continuity after the event is over. But now they're looking at a blended approach. So in this new blended approach, they're actually going to spend just a half day in person in the classroom, and they're going to have different ways of applying, practicing, and getting feedback in their working environment. So that's this is how it looks at a conceptual level. Let me show you their actual materials, how they describe this. You can see here they've split this up into 4 sections, weeks 1 through 3+, so this could extend up to 90 days. This first week, on the first day, there's the half-day on-site session. So this is that in-person training. Next, after that, people are on their own in the online platform, which is, of course, the NovoEd platform. But here, they can not only look at the materials, but they can create their own communication based on the next presentation they need to create. They can get feedback on that from experts and peers. In the third week, there is a webinar so that experts, again, will check in with people, answer questions, review things, continue that teaching and instruction and coaching. And then weeks 3 on all the way to 3 months, people will have access to the resources. They can practice. They can discuss things and give each other feedback. So you can see throughout this whole journey here that what they're creating is actually not something that is a poor replacement for a full day of in-person training. It's actually an improvement upon it. It's less time in person, yes, but it's a lot more scope for real application, for genuine feedback to happen, for real habits to form in the working environment. All right, well, as you can see, I'm a big proponent of blended, but is blended all that it's cracked up to be? I mean, are we there yet where it's just simply superior to other forms? Well, not quite. There are many challenges to blended, and so that's an area that I'm going to address next. If we look at the 3 advantages of blended, which I described earlier, flexibility, the multimodal approach, and authentic contexts, there are challenges with that. With the flexibility of allowing people to do things online to sort of fit their schedule, there are challenges in keeping people on track with that. It's not a one-time event, and people need to persist. There's this concept now of a drop-off rate, of participation rate, of engagement rates. These types of things are important, and it's hard to keep people's attention. It's also more challenging to establish norms if you want people to discuss things and share things with each other, but they have flexibility. They do need to understand and establish norms around that kind of sharing, so that's important. With a multimodal approach, it's great that there's a lot of tech tools out there, but the challenges with that are, I think staying aware of what the different tech tools are is a big challenge in and of itself. Obviously, if you're using different tools, making sure they integrate seamlessly, especially for the end user, is crucial. And even if they do integrate seamlessly, you could still have user experience complexity and confusion. If you ask people to use 5 different tools, and they're getting used to 5 different interfaces, it might or might not be overwhelming for them in that environment. With the authentic context, there are some challenges there as well. With real exercises, real things that they're doing in their workplace or in their organizations, it can be difficult to separate out cause and effect. I tried this technique, it didn't work, but was that because I wasn't doing it well, or was it because of the specifics of this particular context? That can be challenging. It's also challenging to have expert feedback in those contexts because you do want to have that expert component of making sure people are being guided down the right path. So how do you address these challenges, especially with all the promise of new technologies out there? How do you address these challenges when you're developing the online portion of your blended program? There's 3 sort of principles that I would advocate for, and the overall point being that careful tool selection, they won't solve your challenges, but they can help maximize your chances of success. The 3 principles are looking at availability of technology, considering usability, and then as well feasibility. Let's start with availability. Here is a technology learning stack from Burson. You can see the reference to it at the bottom. And what's happening is that, there used to be, at least in the corporate world, an LMS and maybe an e-learning authoring tool. And now there's really growing different segments in different categories of things. There's things related to experience. There's things that are related to content. You can see NovoEd is there in the top middle, program experience platforms. But now there's just a lot more categories to be aware of, and you really need to have some, if you're in this space and you're thinking about blending, you really need to have some understanding of what these different categories are. And those that are of particular interest, you want to dive further and understand those even better. In addition to those categories from Burson, I created a few that are particularly relevant for blending. You've got the live virtual teaching tools. So this could be, we are on a webinar here. All of you are on mute, sort of listen-only mode. But there are online classroom type tools as well, where everyone's picture is up there. People can raise their hands and interact. So there's a great number of tools out there. Zoom is a very popular one. Adobe Connect is well utilized within higher education, but they're all improving and getting better. E-learning authoring tools, to create content. There's those have been around for quite some time. Presentation tools to create compelling, more interactive, graphically oriented presentations of content. And then collaboration tools, whether it's for people to share documents with each other or share messages with each other. There's a lot of tools for this, and this is becoming increasingly popular. So if these areas are important for your area of blending, you want to dive into them and at least understand the major players here from here, or there's other references you can find online so that you can be aware of the right tools that might be appropriate for your application. Next one about usability. Here's what I would say is as succinct as I can put it, is that today's learners have a usability standard. Unfortunately, that standard is smartphone apps. And I say unfortunately because it's hard to meet that standard. They're simple, they're well designed, they're meant to be extremely easy to use. The expectation now is for consumer grade experiences. It used to be that in organizations, people would kind of vacillate between, well, should we build something ourselves? Should we buy it, et cetera, et cetera. Now I see things tilting way towards buying because organizations know that even if they were to develop something really good that met their needs, the likelihood of them being able to keep it up to meet the ongoing user experience expectations is going to be very challenging. It's going to be very difficult. So many more people are buying these days. One positive thing about that, though, however, I will note that second bullet point is that people are used to switching between apps. So it's not as if you need the same look and feel across everything. People will go into Facebook and send messages to their friends. They'll go into Instagram and they'll look at their feed. They'll go to their email and read messages. So people can switch between apps. That's normal behavior. However, the slight caveat there is that it's got to be intuitive. Each interface has to be intuitive. It has to be purposeful. People are not going to look through instructions to learn how to use an app. So the standards are still quite high in that regard. And then the third point is that while technology has changed, a lot of learning principles have not changed. And one of the key ones that we all need to keep in mind is cognitive load. Human beings, we only have a certain amount of attention span. We have a limited working memory capacity, and there is a high risk of cognitive overload where the ability, especially in a learning context, to store information can be hampered by causing too much stress and tension on other areas of their cognitive capacity. So we do need to keep that in mind as a balancing factor to some of these other things. Bottom line is that if you introduce a new interface to a user, you have to make sure that the benefits outweigh the costs. So the benefits of doing that, and by costs, I don't mean dollar costs. I mean the cognitive cost. I mean the effort. I mean the tech support costs. I mean the potential confusion. All of those mental costs required have to be less than the benefits that they're getting from this new tool or this new app or this new cool toy that you're presenting to the users. So that's on the usability side. I would say that there's one more thing on the feasibility side. And feasibility I'm describing as a larger concept than just usability. So usability is a particular user interface easy to use? Feasibility is it realistic to expect that particular tool to be used in this environment, in the context of where that learner is? Oftentimes this context is in their working environment. So what's going on there? Are people going to be motivated to use this? Is it seen as important? Is there a culture of learning, or is there not so much? Are the existing workloads so heavy that people just absolutely have no time? Or could they make time for paying attention to what you have to offer here? How much change are you asking of people in terms of their behaviors? We know the greater amount of change you ask, the more difficult it gets. And frankly, a lot of settings, there may not be the tech savviness that you would need in order to implement something, even if it's highly usable for average users. It may not be in a particular environment. So you've got to look at feasibility as well as usability as sort of a broader context. All right, so those are the three sort of principles to look at technology choices. Availability, make sure you know what's out there. Usability, think about what you're asking of your learners and focus on that user experience. And then feasibility, what's realistic to expect in that organizational setting. Let's move on to our second case study. And this case study is a leadership development organization called Entelechy. Their website is there, www.unlockit.com. Entelechy creates leadership development programs for a lot of large organizations. And the example that I have here is going to be one that is a sort of a flagship leadership development program. The program is actually done for their client Comcast. There's a white paper that's been published about this from ATD, so I can speak about it. But here you can see the design's a little bit different. So it starts out, there's a little bit of an online introduction, but there's a 2-day in-person training that's happening. And then after that, there are a series of online modules. And then along with those online modules, there is a virtual session each week. And that virtual session is, they call it a digital campfire. It's basically a place to have Q&A and discuss and so forth. And then after they've done a certain number of those, I think 6 or 7, they come back and do another 2-day in-person leadership training. So this is a much heavier ask in terms of the commitment. And this would be a blended program that would be geared, for example, to get leaders to that next level of leadership, to really improve their skills in being managers or being directors within the organization. Here's a description of some of that program in a little bit more depth here. So it's a 12-week program. You can see on the left there's different elements involved. This blended program does include, for example, an e-document. So Inkling is used for that e-document that's used to keep a field journal. And you can see a graphical representation on the right of the trek or the sequence that they're going through. You can see that they prepare for the trek, and trek 1 is taking stock. These two happen virtually. There's a 360-degree evaluation that's incorporated in this period. And then trek 2, you can sort of think of it as module 2, is base camp, which is 2 days in person. Then you go from treks 3 through 7, which are all virtual, and people are doing things online, again with the the weekly webinars as I described. And then you get to the summit towards the end, which is the 2-day in-person, sort of a capstone project, capstone learning at the end. So this is yet another example of blending, a much more involved one, where you're really trying to, this might replace, say, a 2-week in-person leadership seminar or program. All right, now I'm ready to get to the blending blueprint. So let me describe an approach. Hopefully, up until this point, you've seen at least my argument for why the blending boom is a particularly successful one now, driven by some major trends. Hopefully, you're thinking about blending in terms of, wow, new possibilities. What can I blend? What can I put online? Maybe those things that I thought were limits or limitations before aren't really. How do I go about doing that? Let's talk about this now. I've got a 4-step process I would suggest here. And the 4-step process is to assess the importance of the gems of face-to-face learning, as we described, determine the potential technology you could bring to bear, so similar to what we talked about earlier. 3, address those gaps with the in-person components that you need. And then 4, you need to design the mix of the different components of the blend. So let's go through those 4. Number 1, assessing the gem importance. So these were the 3 gems: relationships, expertise, and peer learning. And if you think about that, what do you, if you think about each of those as a scale or a dimension, where are you in your particular learning program in terms of what you need there? So that light blue circle represents maybe for this particular training program that you have in mind, it needs to be fairly social, but not, amazingly so. So you would score along the scale with that blue dot. And then the same for expertise and peer learning. Where do you scale these? Step 2 is then determining potential tech. And this is what we covered with respect to understanding the tech that's out there, putting it through the 3 screens of availability, usability, feasibility, and coming up with the tool set that you want to use. Step 3 then is addressing those gaps. So with the tech you select, and I recognize there's a little bit of a chicken and egg there. You want to look at the technology at the same time as you're assessing your learning needs and kind of, iterate back and forth, really thinking through, okay, how can this technology help me in this regard? But if you score your technology with these pink dots, then you can see where there are gaps. So in this particular case, there's a gap between the 2 colored dots in the relationship scale and in the peer learning scale, but not necessarily in the expertise scale. Obviously, the next point then is to address and fill those gaps. But this does bring us to the more complex of the 4 steps here, and that is designing the mix. How do we actually design the mix now? There's 3 things I want to point out here. One is I want to point out the sequence of where an in-person happens. And I'm going to show you 4 different models here of how they're sequenced. It could happen at the beginning. So you could have the in-person first and then online modules. And that can be good for, your traditional implementing what you've learned. And that's probably the most common model, I would say. The second one is flipping that and basically turning the online into pre-work. So if you've got something that's, say your in-person event is at an annual meeting. Well, in that case, you expect it to be quite consequential, and you've got plenty of time to get people sort of prepared and ready to, maybe make some changes or make some decisions at that meeting. So here you can have some online modules. The challenge there is that, you want to make sure people are engaged and are willing to do their pre-work. People are notorious for not doing pre-work, so you actually probably can't call it pre-work. That just is a synonym for skippable material in a lot of people's minds. But there's things you can do to make some meaningful milestones before that in-person event. Third is the in-person plus online with some coaching. I call it coaching as a model, but they're webinars. They could be Q&A webinars. So you could have something, it's sort of an enhancement of the first one, where you still have an opportunity to introduce something somewhat live, even though virtual, and you can introduce some expertise in that regard as well. And then fourth, here, this is the Entelechy example that we saw, is really more than one in-person session in combination with online. And the way to think about that is, or one way I've labeled it is, take-home work, if you will, in between the sessions, at the risk of trivializing it. And this could be important for, I see this used in HYPO programs, so high potential leadership development programs. Maybe those programs last 9 months or a year, and they're getting together every other month in order to do some activities. Well, you may want to have them do things in between that time as well in order to support their learning journey along the way. All right, so that's, I would say, the first step is think about what sequence here might make sense for you. Next, after that is then taking your learning content and modularizing it. So you can see here that the first thing I'll point out is that we have modules that are aligned as steps towards a learning goal or set of learning objectives. And they're arranged as steps because they're sequenced in a certain way to get people to build upon what's learned in the prior module and to reach that learning goal. Here you might have your in-person component, in this case, cover the first 1.5 modules, and then you would have online the rest of the modules. So, really modularizing your content and then looking at, okay, now I've got 1.5 modules in person. How do I need to design those? And then I've got 3.5 modules online. Then start tackling how you would need to design those. So that's one approach to kind of think about it in this way. And then next, and the final one aspect of doing this is to design what those module activities are. And here I'm talking about the online component. For the in-person component, the traditional instructional design principles still apply. Here we're talking about online, and I've got an example here of a module, and this module is related to pitching a new innovation. And what you can do is you can outline the sequence of what's going to be covered in that module, starting from the bottom to the top. So first, you want people to learn, and these are sort of the learning objectives. You want people to learn what makes effective pitches, understand the key elements of a pitch, learn how to support them with evidence, and then combine them into an overall story. Well, each of those you would break down into potential activities that are online. So for this basic learning what makes effective pitches, you could have videos, you could have resources that you point to. You could have an online discussion board where people discuss this. To understand the key elements of a pitch, you might have a Prezi presentation to present things in a little bit more visual way. You might have live polls so people can see other reactions from others. To learn how to support things with evidence, you might have a role play scenario. Maybe you've got some exercise where people can take on some sort of argumentation role with each other. And that role play could be technology enabled or it may not be. It really could be either. But you could certainly put it as part of the online program. And then maybe you have a self-reflection. And we saw in the Entelechy example that self-reflections were captured in a field journal using Inkling in that case. And then the final one is combining the elements into a story flow. And here this might be a good time to have a virtual session where you actually can interact with people in real time. This might be a good place to have peer feedback where you group people into groups or pair them off into peers and have them share their stories with each other and give each other feedback. So this is sort of high level, I know, but this structure sort of helps me as I think through things. is really it's really a matter of breaking things down. It's what am I trying to accomplish at the module level? Which modules do I need to think about designing in an online way? And for those modules, how can I take the learning objectives and incorporate online components that can support those objectives? Of course, I want to keep in mind my principles of usability and feasibility. I don't want to ask people to use 20 different tools just to complete a 15-minute module. But this is sort of the process that you would do in the context of a normal instructional design flow in order to create this. All right, the final case study, and then I'll just get to sort of a summary of everything here, and then we'll be able to conclude, and I'll answer any questions that may pop up as well. Feel free to put those in chat if you have any. The final case study is Georgia Tech. It's actually the Scheller School of Business at Georgia Tech. And what they have is a 3-day residential program on their campus. But the way that they've designed it is that people have to do some pre-work online first for a couple of weeks. Then they come on site for the 3 days and learn from their fabulous instructors, their professors there. Then they come back onto the online environment and they apply what they learned and pick a project to work on in their organization. There are webinars as well along the way. So again, we have that mix of the online and the offline. Here's an example schedule of one of Georgia Tech's programs. It's for their client, Clorox. And you can see there along the top, you've got weeks 1 through 6. And each of those are different modules. Most of them are online, except for week 3, you see the full agenda of the in-person program. So you really see the whole thing at a glance, and people know that what's in that circled box is what we're going to experience in the residential program. But all these other things are important too. They're part of the whole learning journey. This whole thing is really blended together. It's not just simple pre-work for the in-person program. People have an understanding that these things work in combination. They will be applying things. They will be accountable for what they put together after the session in their online teams and work groups. Okay, we've been through a lot, and if you've stuck with me this far, I do appreciate your patience. Sort of as a reward for that, I'm going to give you a summary of things. Real quickly about NovoEd, I do want to articulate our sort of philosophy around these things. It does shape, how I think about things, so I think it's good to know. Our platform, the NovoEd platform, it's what's used in the 3 case studies that I described in this webinar. But it helps promote the relationships, in terms of the 3 gems, if you will. It helps promote relationships. People can work in small groups together. Everyone has a learning profile with a reputation, so to speak. Expert feedback, there are formal evaluations. There's a mentor functionality in our platform, so you can incorporate different mentor type paradigms. And then peer learning is really something that we excel at. We have project work galleries. We have ways of getting people to give feedback in both structured and unstructured ways, really having people interact with each other and not make learning online a solo experience. I think that is the main crux of what we're trying to do. All right, so here are the 3 summaries. I do have in these frameworks a lot of things with the number with groups of 3, so I apologize for that. I tried to mix it up so that there are there's a 2 in there and there's a 4 in there, just so it's can be recalled. But we're starting with 3 shifts in learning that we see, and then the 3 things that blending offers that takes advantage of those shifts. We're talking about 3 gems that are traditionally the stronghold of face-to-face training that can be done online to some extent, but are 3 things you want to pay attention to that are candidates for keeping in person. And we have our 2 questions for determining what to blend. We have a list of blending challenges, which are quite a number of them. And we also have 3 criteria for selecting tools to help address those challenges. Finally, we have our 4-step blueprint in terms of determining what the right mix should be, picking the right sequence, and really getting you on your way to developing your blended program. Here's a summary of the blending blueprint. We've got steps 1 through 4, and we have the end result, which are the activities. And then I've even got a summary of our 3 case studies here. The presentation company, Entelechy, Georgia Tech, Scheller School of Business. We've got the 3 different models of blending that's represented there graphically, and just a very quick summary of the details of how that's done. I know these case studies, they kind of just whiz by, so I wanted to give you a reference so that you could look at it in case you wanted to look at it a little bit further. All right, I'm going to get to some questions, but before I do, let me do this so that those of you who need to drop off can. I'm going to share a few resources with you. I'm going to share 4 resources. The first is my email address. Feel free to write me if you've got thoughts, if you've got questions, if you've got great ideas or great resources you want to share with me. I'm happy to collect those and share those with others. We have NovoEd offers a free course that actually started yesterday, and all of you are welcome to join or check it out if you like. It's called the Learning Experience Design course. It does kind of showcase our platform a little bit, but the focus of that course is on designing an online module. So I believe we have 300 or 400 people, 200 or 300 people enrolled in that course from around the world. Please, feel free to come in and take a look by going to that link. I've got a white paper on transforming learning design. If you're interested, it's a 30-page ebook. And I do have a prior webinar that I did that really focused in on migrating in-person training online. So it's not really the blended topic, but it's about sort of translating something online. And I've got a link for you to go and check out those slides and webinar recording if you're interested in that. All right, with that, I'll just cover 1 or 2 questions and then we'll conclude. All right, one question is, what's the average half-life of developed online training materials? Online, so this is a good point. So there is something to consider here. If you are teaching in person, you can change that. You can change what you teach, the style of what you teach fairly easily through the instructor. If you're putting things online, it does create a debt of maintenance. It creates a maintenance debt. So if things change, if a diagram changes, if an approach changes, you need to make sure those things are updated as well. So you do want to be careful about that. However, my suggestion on that front is don't separate out the in-person and the online so much that they're 2 separate things to maintain. Essentially, whoever you have that's facilitating the in-person training, make them also responsible for monitoring the online environment and keeping it up to date. They should own the material across both so that they really think of the online as a blend of their in-person and online, not as something separate that all of a sudden becomes static and stale and so forth. So essentially, I guess my answer is by giving people ownership of that, hopefully you'll tap into their normal, sort of instincts to kind of watch out for their students and keep things up to date. Second question is, if you outsource all your training, what's the best way to compare various online materials with expert service providers? So I know there are an increasing number of organizations that look to outside companies to outsource their training. I think there's lots of great third-party training providers, not just training content providers, but really training program providers. They're really becoming good receptacles of best practices because they're doing this over and over and over again, whereas others might be doing this only once per year. So Is there a great way to compare them? I don't have any special insight into that. I would point you to looking at resources from ATD, Association of Talent Development. They work with a lot of different providers, and they've got different resources maybe to help you look at them and compare. I guess the thing I would say is, have them give you a capabilities presentation where they present their point of view. And their point of view shouldn't be, well, what do you think? Because we're likely to agree with it. They should really have some strong point of view in some areas, still being flexible, but they should be able to come to you and say, well, we find this works well and that doesn't work well. And if they've got their own ideas around that, then I think that's a good start for being a trusted provider. All right. Thank you, everyone. We're at time, and I hope you all have a wonderful day, and we will send you a link to the recording of this webinar and the slides. By the way, I know some of you may be wondering, if you're counting the gems, please put in the chat how many gems you saw in this program, and your special prize will be an infographic. We're going to have an infographic created out of some of the content in this presentation, and we'll send that infographic to you first exclusively for at least a month before we find some other way to share that infographic. So please go ahead and put in the number of gems, and if you happen to cheat and want to put in the mode answer that you see in the chat, that's fine as well. All right, thank you, everyone. Have a great day. Bye-bye.